a performance from many years ago when I did the very first exhibition of TBA21 in Dubrovnik in 2002. And he's going to reenact this performance. Jana Winderen is going to give us some excerpts of a piece that she's working on that was initiated on this during this pilot project this summer in Iceland. And Tommy sorry, now I'm going to forget how to pronounce his second name. Daniela, help me. Is going to take us and sway us away in the cloister downstairs for later on with the performance of his music. So I hope that you all manage to brave the weather, because it will change over during the night. So have plenty of drinks and stay warm. You'll also have dinner afterwards, and you'll probably notice that this kitchen is now being used for the first time in 250 years. And this is the first meal being prepared in this building for over a century, so I can tell you this is a very special dinner tonight. So I'd like to introduce the panelists of this. I've just mentioned Jana Winderen, who's from Norway, and I think most of you have already met her this evening, but a great sound artist who I met, who's commissioned to do a project for the Morning Line, and ever since then she's intrigued me with her underwater recordings, and she had us all under her spell the whole time we were in Iceland together. Fionn Meade is a curator and a residence professor at New York.
I teach at Columbia and at Bard.
At Columbia and at Bard, and a freelance curator, and very familiar with the Central and South American regions and in North America. So hopefully somebody is going to give us some ideas over the next few days on how to go about our adventures. Tony Myatt, you know, our sound man, but director of technology for the University of York, and somebody who I have learned to really admire and respect, not only as a friend but as a colleague, and with whom I'm prepared to cover any distance and physically and technically to go. Oh, no, it's okay. We're good friends. Everybody knows that. And Stewart Richardson, who I'm thrilled to introduce to you as the captain of the vessel that you can see behind us, who has joined the boat just recently and will be actually, as of January, the fully fledged captain. He's now busy taking very, very serious and difficult exams. So he's off the boat temporarily during the next 3 months. This is the beginning of our journey, and you see the Dardanella is in Seyðisfjörður, which is on the eastern coast of Iceland, in a fjord where Dieter Roth had a studio, and a number of artists like to live there, and it's a really interesting small community. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures of the boat. This is a killer whale just floating. You can see here, just unfortunately, just a tad of it missing. As it crests its wave next to the Dardanella, which was now at this point more just offset Grímsey, which is an island right off the north of Iceland. We had absolutely extraordinary weather, I have to say, throughout the whole journey. Very few occasions did I feel seasick at all. So I now have said I think I have my sea legs. But this is essentially a research vessel. It is designed by Vrijpack, was built in Wittes in Holland. It's an aluminum hull. It's 38 meters long. It has a 6,000 to 7,000 nautical mile radius. In other words, it can travel to the Caribbean and come back on one tank of gas. You wouldn't really necessarily want to do that, but it does have that potential of very long range. It's quite slow. It cruises at 10 to 11 knots, and it has the capacity to carry a tremendous amount of booze. And in fact, I've noticed that the more booze there is on the boat, the more stable she is. And the same thing as with the gas tanks. The more gas she has, the more stable she is. Doesn't mean we're very necessarily the more stable. In the front, you see these are the docks for the tender. We have 2 tenders. There's this is, we call it affectionately the bumblebee, and this saved our asses in Canada. Trust me, it was so cold in Canada that we actually enjoyed very much being slightly undercover. This is Jana, Tony, and Chris speeding off and this is one of the very northern fjords in the north of Iceland. This is the position where you cross into the Arctic Circle. In fact, all the uniforms are by North 66, which is a really good Icelandic company for out-sea wear. We documented all of the events that took place during these 10 days, where Chris, Jana, and Tony were on the boat during this pilot project. The gentleman with the red T-shirt that you can see, I've forgotten his name now. Have you also? He had a very complicated Icelandic name, but he's a marine biologist from Akureyri, and we had a very interesting lady called Marianne, who was Danish, who was running the whale research facility in Husavik. These people are not lightweight travelers. The entire living quarters, or salon as we call it, of the living room, have been transformed into a laboratory of science and technology, and particular sound production. So these are mainly Jana's traveling cases, I think, combination of Jana and Chris's traveling cases. We basically set off from the boat on a daily basis from the morning until quite late at night with these two tenors to basically take recordings. So this is just a very general introduction. Chris Watson, who worked for many years with David Attenborough as a sound recorder for all the wildlife programs that they produced, the Blue Earth, the Frozen Earth, Frozen Planet. I mean, there are a lot of BBC TV series. But he's been working on his own independently for many years as a sound composer as well, similarly to Jana. And he had a very long life dream to chase after blue whales. So we took off from Husavik looking for this very elusive blue whale. Here you see Stewart. We're all extremely well wrapped up, as you can see. This is Jana. And we went out and on the very, very first day, we encountered a blue whale. We didn't see it, but luckily, with this incredible recording equipment, we actually heard it. We never heard another one again. It was a bit of a loose goose chase afterwards for the next 10 days, but we set off every day with a lot of positive spirit because we knew we'd already had at least one recording of one blue whale. Jana takes her recording very, very seriously, and as you can see, I didn't want to make a really big faux pas, but I have to say on the first day to just sit on the boat and watch her put all her cables together, it was quite a sight. And to start the hours that she spends out in any location, whether it be on the tenders or on the cliffs, hanging off the edges of cliffs and diving over glaciers and pools of water. And there's no terrain that's too unfriendly for Jana, and no temperature out there that can put her off her work. There's Chris, actually, then the numerous hours spent at sea, to the point where we thought we'd lost them a couple of times and sent out sort of endless calls that never were answered because they'd switch off all the mics on the boat and no phones. And here we are on Flatley, which is a small island on the west coast of Iceland, where Chris had been recording these krya, which are these very small birds that, and this is us on this famous Black Pebble Beach, and again recording the water and the waves. This is Jana and Chris up on the top of the glacier. So we actually covered tremendous amount of ground and sea, and have accumulated many, many hours of incredible sounds. And I actually not only learned to listen, because I'm reputed to talk too much, but I learned to listen, and I also had to say I learned to hear, because it's quite different, the sounds of nature when you are in a totally silent environment. Quite extraordinary. Now this pilot project has already resulted in, I mean, Jana had already been invited to MIT, and I've asked her she's invited in a concert series in MIT in October, and I asked her if it was possible at all to already present this new body of work. And so what we're going to hear tonight is some parts of that. But it shows that, to me, the first endeavor that we went, other than just being fascinated and taking thousands of photographs of beautiful, beautiful landscape, and generally having an incredible time being together and learning about the ambionic sound system that Tony has installed on the boat. So other than having extremely sophisticated recording equipment on board, it has also a replay system where one can listen to on basically the same day as moment it is downloaded, these ambionic and special sounding files, which Tony will explain to you about. My dream with this project is has already begun, because after having done my first Atlantic crossing with Marcus, which was already quite something, because we did encounter some horrendous weather at that point off the south tip of Greenland. We embarked on a few days with actually my family and my kids in Greenland, which was spectacular. But we touched Canada, therefore initiating this circumnavigation of the American continent. And the boat is presently in Boston, undergoing some repairs because it didn't like the cold as much as we thought it would. But we're dealing with that, and she will now continue this journey southwards, going down the eastern coast of the Americas all the way to Antarctica. So these Google Maps, which is really all we've come up with so far, indicates the routes that we have actually started to undertake. So we're now up in H and J, having gone through A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And that was this summer. And by Christmas, we're going to be done in Florida and hoping to get to New Orleans in February. But I think I'm going to let the captain, Stewart Richardson, take us actually through this, because I think you are have been thinking about this route a lot, yeah, and have particular experience in certain areas. So maybe just to start this conversation off before we get more arty about the whole thing, maybe we should get on a real practical level about where we're going to go and how we're going to get there.
Well, thank you, Francesca. Yeah, as Francesca says, we touched the American continent sort of mid-August, really, early part of August, sorry. And from that point, the clock was ticking, and Francesca has this dream to circumnavigate the Americas, which we will do over the next 3, possibly 4 years, depending on how quickly we travel or how interesting the trip is. And I think that's one of the interesting things for me about this trip is it seems the more you get into it, the more you get under the skin of the continent of America, the more you want to see. And I think particularly once we start hitting the Central American countries, that will happen more and more. And every day you see something, you want to go further. But currently, as Francesca says, the boat's sitting in Boston, having some work done to her. Not unlike this stunning building, I suppose. She needs a fair bit of TLC, because the kitchen's used more than the odd 250-year breaks. And so she's being worked on, and it's going to be a regular pattern that the boat will need working on. But at the moment, she's happy in Boston, and Francesca and Marcus join the boat towards the end of the month, the 22nd, I believe, and then the boat will be heading down towards New York, and then sort of getting into the Florida area, Miami, in December. And then, as Francesca said, we're going to move around into the Gulf of Mexico, into New Orleans, for around the 20th of February. And that's really when the trip will start again in the new year. Up until then, the schedule isn't particularly busy, but once we hit New Orleans, the schedule will start becoming fairly hectic, and we'll be moving quickly. Well, not necessarily as quickly as possible. We'll have to move fairly quickly to get to certain geographical points within time frames to try and maximise the opportunity of this trip. So from New Orleans, we'll be heading a little further west to Houston, and from there we will then head across the Gulf of Mexico down towards southern Mexico itself. We will then follow the coast onto Honduras and into Belize. From Belize, we'll be going towards Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and then Venezuela. Obviously, all these sort of South American, Central American countries offer a huge amount of diversity, whether that's in the water, on the coastline, in the interior. And so all of these trips will have to be well planned, and we can work work a schedule that suits everybody. So, for example, if there's something of interest inland, we can drop people who can travel inland, and we can continue down the coast and meet them at another point. So what this does, as the boat transits the coast of the Americas, it gives people the opportunity both inland and at sea to sort of use the facility that the boat offers. From Venezuela, we'll then be sort of heading out to sea a little bit and then heading down into the coast of Brazil. One of our focal points is getting to the mouth of the Amazon River in early June, which will then give us a chance to transit the Amazon River itself and probably travel 500 miles inland. And again, that offers huge opportunities. There's a huge bridge being built at the moment across the river at Macau, and that will then lead into settlements in the forest itself, something that hasn't been seen really before, not in recent times, and how that's going to affect and change the ecology of the whole place whilst controlling illegal logging and that sort of thing. So there's going to be all sorts of fascinating subjects that come up as we travel around the coast. From the Amazon, we'll then head south again, following the coast of Brazil. We'll undoubtedly take a decent stop in Rio and sample all the delights that had to be had there. And then traveling south again, we'll sort of head towards Sao Paulo, and that'll give us the opportunity to cruise the islands of Paraty and Ilhabela as we head south. So Brazil, we may spend probably 3 to 4 months in Brazil itself. There's a lot to see, and as I'm sure you all know, the more you get into it again, the more you'll want to see. From Brazil, it takes us to Uruguay. So on the map there, we're looking at sort of point N as a reference. Uruguay shares the River Plate with Argentina, and so we have 2 major cities there of Montevideo and Buenos Aires, either side of the river, which are only a day's travel away. So again, there's more involved sort of work inland and on shore that we at sea we can do there. Coming out of the River Plate and heading south again, we'll transit the coast of Argentina, and Argentina is one of these countries that offers a wealth of incredible things inland, the history of the gauchos, Mendoza, the pampas grasses. So that's a classic example of where you may find more projects inland as opposed to on the sea. As we head south, we'll come down towards the islands of the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina, and also there's the island of South Georgia, which is again further out to sea. By now we're looking at being in what's known as the sub-Antarctic areas of the world. So we're at about 50 degrees south, not far off what's called the polar convergence zone. And so once we start getting into these sort of areas, the Falkland Islands, for example, icebergs are in the ocean drifting around, and so life changes. We've been fairly used to the tropical weather by now, but now we get back into the cold and the ice. And this, for me, is where we'll start to see a huge amount of wildlife. Most of the wildlife that you'll see at sea tends to be in the colder poles, and so penguins, the albatross, the whales, they will all be in abundance in these parts of the world. From the Falkland Islands, we'll probably head back in towards the coast of Argentina and into the bottom of South America itself. In terms of timescale, we're probably looking at December 2012 by the time we get down there.
To Antarctica?
Well, to the sort of Cape Horn area, mainland South America. There, of course, we've got Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia running north from us, but what we're hoping to be able to do is, instead of running straight north, we'll turn left and go south again into Antarctica. And so where we've just done a trip in the Arctic this summer, on the southern summer of 2012/13, we hope to be able to make a trip into Antarctica. Again, the wildlife, the scenery, the provocative nature of the area with the Antarctic Treaty coming up for renewal in 2041. There's a huge amount in the press already about what's happening there, whether it's scientific or artistic, and it's one of those places as well, the more time you spend there, the more fascinating it becomes. I think one of the reasons that I feel fortunate to have met Francesca and to be involved with this project is I was lucky enough to spend the best part of the last 4 years actually in Antarctica and Patagonia and Argentina itself, running a commercial charter yacht. And what our job was we were chartered by filmmakers, by scientists, or by mountaineers, expeditionists, adventurers, to take them to these sort of far-flung corners of the world, to Antarctica, South Georgia, Patagonia. And so really what my role was there was to run and manage a boat, but most importantly really to the charter client to be the support. We were offering them the support of a boat. Dardanella is a great example of that. She has huge longevity at sea, a very big volume, so we can carry a lot of equipment to support any activities that go on. You can almost compare a boat like Dardanella to a small island in effect. Everything that you take with you, you have, and you can sustain yourselves in remote parts of the world for a long period of time. So the beauty of that is you can go to any geography really, and you can find interesting projects and you can spend time. You don't necessarily have to rush off. You can spend time and you can wait, and you have the ability to sustain yourselves for a long period of time. You're not relying on outside help. And so you can make of the project exactly what it is. It also means you can get away from the general traffic. You can get away from get off the beaten track. You can go and find places of your own where perhaps no one's been before. You can discover what's there. And again, you can then work out the projects as you go. In our role of support, it effectively becomes just a logistical challenge, really, from the initial planning to the conception of the idea, to making the idea happen, to planning it, logistics of getting equipment into these parts of the world, to managing the weather, to managing the boat, and then also collecting the information. And then once we have data and information, particularly the technical type that Jana and Tony are collecting and storing on the boat, we can then use that in this living archive to be something beneficial to everybody. Dardanella herself is kitted out with huge amounts of storage and data storage, and so anything that we capture on these trips, as you saw in the slides earlier on, meetings around the table in the saloon are recorded. So the whole idea is as the boat travels around the Americas, all this information will be collected and gathered and put towards whatever that may be in time. The trip down towards Antarctica should be done really by, I guess, January 2013 if we put a date on it. And then, of course, we have the trip north up the Pacific coast of America. We haven't got any flags in the sand as yet as to where we may go. The simple reason for that is, as you can see, there's a huge amount of opportunity in front of us yet. We've got at least 14, 15 months to work on that opportunity before we need to start looking into what takes us up the west coast.
Okay, thanks, Stewart. Well, one of the important parts about Stewart joining the crew is that he was very enthusiastic with his wife, Jess. They've obviously been down that part of the world for some years, and they know a lot of people that are very engaged in this area. And in a way, that's what we're looking for and seeking out, is are people with some level of engagement or at least a desire to engage. And we listed a number of cities because they're on the map of where we can get people on and off the boats. But these are basically what I would call ports of call, and everything in between, which is this uncharted area where we don't know yet what these places could be as potential hosts for projects. We're hoping to initiate projects at this stage so that when the boat gets to them, they are already ready for presentation, and at the same time invite artists as well as other people from different disciplines on board so that they can also interact with these areas, and we can go and revisit that later on. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Tony to sort of bring in, he was actually one of the first of the few guinea pigs that we had on the boat, and I think not something any of us regret really. But maybe, Tony, you can go into a little bit some of the technology that the boat has and how you see it, with what potential you feel it might have.
Sure, thank you. I guess it was last Christmas time when we started to discuss sound capabilities of Dardanella and making it possible for the boat to be the boat's use to be modified slightly to support some of this activity. And I guess a number of threads of activity came out of some of the work we've been doing on Morning Line. And one of the things that Francesca said immediately was that we need to think about, if we're going to be working in sound development and the development of sound works, to think about surround sound and the type of projects that we've been doing in Morning Line. And in a sense that came together in the trip that we made in Iceland, which was both the trial of people, personnel, the boat, and the productivity of the vessel, as well as a way of working out ideas, which I think we're still doing, not only by talking to everybody here today, but also I think over the next few months we're also talking to as many people as we can about how and this might work and what the practicalities are of the whole thing. So my role in a technical sense was to equip the boat with a series of surround sound systems. I will be saying a little bit more about surround sound and things tomorrow morning, so I don't want to say too much about the technical details, except to say we have about 30 speakers distributed over the boat in various different rooms. And it's designed specifically to operate with ambisonic technology, which is a technology that can capture three-dimensional sound fields. So we also have equipped the boat with sound recording gear and field recording equipment that we can take out into the field to capture surround sounds. In addition to that, we have air mics, hydrophones, and a variety of things that might allow people to realise different projects on land, on the sea, whatever. I think part of the initial discussion that we had was about the idea that scientists and research might take place on the vessel also. And I, again, took the lead in that, in the sense of that, and particularly with the artists we were working with, Chris and Jana, who are both interested in making sound installations and creating surround works. So we've already begun some small-scale research projects in developing new sort of engineering technologies that might facilitate them to make some of these pieces. And that was really begun when we started to work in Iceland. Chris Watson has a desire to not only track down the blue whale, but also make some large-scale sound installations of the sort of scale of which he's not made to date, which feature some of the more rare mammals, and particularly the more difficult ones to record. Blue whales, you probably you may know, have a fundamental pitch to their song, which is at 8 hertz. Which is way below the capability of human hearing. So this presents not only a lot of challenges for us to capture that, but also to think about how we represent it and how we can allow people to experience that in some way. Fortunately, the songs that we did capture, which were sort of communication calls, were a little bit higher than the fundamental song, but even so, they were incredibly low and powerful sounds. Jana and Winderen also had this project to begin looking at reefs around the world and to try and both document and record and present aesthetically different underwater recordings. Jana's quite famously has a number of recordings of cod and haddock speaking to each other. And I have to say I didn't realise how common this was until we dropped the hydrophones in the water in Iceland and heard some very similar sort of sounds. In a sense, these two projects were ideal to facilitate through Dardanella the types of sound recording system, the types of place that Dardanella could go to. So we chose both of those as a test of the practicalities of getting ourselves out on the sea, gathering information, making recordings, and also taking the time to do some discussions and interviews and things about what might happen to this material and how it might come together. Almost from the very first time we started talking about surround sound and thinking about doing that in the marine environment, I was contacted by a researcher from Cornell University who have a fantastic marine mammal research program there. And it turned out they're also interested in surround sound, but haven't moved in that direction because they're interested in tracking more directionality than just counting species, counting numbers of species. So we've begun some preliminary discussions with them, and we're also going to take the projects that we've done in Iceland to MIT later this month and engage. I think with we have about 15 people from different disciplinary backgrounds at MIT who are going to come on board and talk to us, hear some of the work we've done, just to see what we can, what we've been doing, and we hope we'll engage them in some sort of dialogue about how we can progress things. I don't know what else I could say about the archive, but there is a mission to take all of the information that's gathered for artistic projects and or for scientific projects which might take place on the boat into an archive which can be accessed and used in a way for any research fellow who's resident on the boat. How this is going to work is going to be a very interesting thing to develop and consider and engage with. What we do know at this time is there's a huge amount of data and a huge amount of obviously tagging, geotagging, time tagging, personnel tagging, documentation that has to go along with all of that. But I think the aim is to build up this archive that traces the line of Dardanella's passage around, which may be simple, take the form of a simple documentation, maybe something specific to do with scientific investigation or artistic development. And it would be interesting to see how those materials get used and what can be facilitated by just making that data available.
Thank you, Tony. Well, what you pointed out there is that how in initiation we started off as a pilot project to see and to develop also the technology on the boat with two artists that we both love and respect and who gave their time and who took, obviously it was an opportunity for them, but as well they were extremely generous with their contribution to the archive as well as their investment in time of helping us to think about how this might move forward. But it's very exciting to see that how much feedback you're getting just out of this 1 week we spent together. And I know that this is my hope and my dream, in a sense, that we can obviously get a lot of spin-off projects building up of this, and every single stop of the way that we go, and everybody that we invite on board. Fionn, we met very briefly in a bar, actually, in Zurich, which is always a good place to meet. When we went both to see Walid Rad's project in exhibition in Zurich not so long ago. But we immediately had a very interesting conversation, notably because we had to go outside and smoke, and that's usually where a lot of people end up having a good conversation. But you very generously offered to start to think about, possible projects and interactions between artists, and also possibly in the environment community or the scientific community, but particularly seen through the art world's eyes, but from a commissioning basis, looking at particular areas where certain artists have had some interest or some interaction. You've sent me a couple of emails. I'm going to throw you right in the deep end and ask you to explain how you see this could possibly develop.
Well, what was interesting in the conversation that we had, the initial conversation with Walid, and we both have worked with Walid, and Walid's a good example of somebody who works with archive in a kind of particular way. One of the things that I was intrigued with in this in a sense, this journey, this idea of sort of a trip of exchange, was there's that sense that often, if you think about something, a trip like that, you would think of it as or one way of thinking of it could be as an expedition. But I think one thing that Walid or even say Foucault has a good line that says, history often takes last things and puts them first. So an expedition assumes that it has to arrive somewhere at the final destination, and that actually, if you assume that, it sort of presumes a certain way of engaging with people, and even landscape or say, even the scientific presumptions that you might make. And that we're all familiar with. This is the sort of progressive, linear notion of history that predominates. And I think if you can adopt a kind of more, I mean, Foucault calls it effective history, which is in a sense, is not seeking conclusions or final definitions, but is very specific and very, in a sense, driven by details and driven by particular exchanges. And if, in that regard, that was what I thought was intriguing in our conversation, was how can a kind of genealogical exchange arise through this itinerary that you have? And that was where we were talking, in particular, that notion that a lot of the places you're going to, or are interested in traveling to, have in very different scales of existing groups of people, particular individuals that are doing very innovative things, but it's scaled quite differently depending on where you're going. And in a sense, one of the things I think that, in addition to the residency aspect of inviting artists onto the Dardanella and thinking through projects or thinking through even content, is that idea that, in a sense, where you're going is also going to be informed by where you've been. And that, to some degree, I think it's a very unusual opportunity to create direct, specific exchange between the places that you're going. And in some ways, so one thing I was thinking, in a sense, was that notion of inverting, in a way, to some degree, not always, but at certain times, the invitation. So that if someone, say, from Port of Spain, Trinidad, that has a long-standing, interesting project that has really influenced the community, that has quite a lot of resonance with, say, New Orleans and the particular cultural history of New Orleans. In a sense, New Orleans could be involved in an invitation from someone from Port of Spain, Trinidad, at the time you arrive in New Orleans, so that you're already creating, in a sense, and then someone in essence from New Orleans could be invited to come. So you're sort of dovetailing the idea of research to a certain degree. Of course, I don't think you do that every time, but I think that idea of a living archive and the layering of it in that notion of an invitation, and the idea that's an unusual opportunity to provide specific exchange between groups or individuals that are in the various places that you want to go, and while allowing for the margin of exploration and surprise along the way. So, I mean, that's particularly how when we were talking about it, I thought was of particular interest as a potential, in a sense, a mode of research.
Yes, it's a particular process. I mean, you missed the commissioning panel this morning, which was really interesting, and listening to the different artists and curators talking about how they're moving towards a more process-oriented way of working and less result-oriented, so that there wasn't so much a bite-sized piece that fit into a gallery exhibition that could go to freeze, and then sort of there is this. I mean, it's not for everybody, but there's certainly a push towards artists working on a very long-term basis on a particular project, which then ends up attracting other artists to come in and engage with the same subject or a similar one, or then there's a curatorial aspect of that artwork that then, draws in different aspects, and that's how the interdisciplinary thing starts to happen.
Yeah.
And it's at the inception of these projects that these sort of collaborations can really start to manifest themselves. And I think, Jana, just to give everybody a chance to introduce their work just initially, and then we'll continue the conversation. You came along on board. We obviously had really greatly loved and admired your work that you did for the Morning Line, which was presented in Istanbul. And your chance to sort of move around with Chris and with Tony, and to obviously do some recordings. I mean, do you feel that this has already led to something else, and is it sort of leading, or is it part of your normal process of working and finding residencies that permit you to go to places where you can do your, because I've seen your laptop is full of images of amazing places. It wasn't the first time you've gone somewhere amazing and exciting.
No, but I think what's fantastic about this opportunity is that it actually can, because when I've been on other trips before, of course, it's the problem when you don't have your own boat and, you know, to organize all this to actually get to the places you would like to go to. That is extremely hard, you know, so that's the opportunity of being part of this is very special in that way. I mean, in Iceland, we could go to places which was not accessible even almost, you know, from in any other way. And so, you know, it does differs a lot, you know, and of course also to be able to spend time and even spending more time even than we did at certain places would be good for some projects, but not necessarily for everybody. But you know, it's also a development of learning the practical things, even if I've done this now for years, the continuous, you know, how this works, you know, to find solutions, and we have time to try out things, you know, which we also spent, I think, a lot of the time doing in Iceland that we wouldn't else have had the possibility to do, you know, because you often rushed if you're somewhere, you know, and you rent a boat for a day or something like that, or for, you know, in just some hours, and you don't have the time to experiment. You do your recording and you just have to rush back, you know. So this is also which was absolutely great to do there, and you know.
Well, you won't believe this, but at a brief moment during this last month, the temporary captain actually asked Sander, who's our deckhand, if he wouldn't like to become first mate, which any deckhand would leap at the opportunity, and he actually turned the job down because he wants to keep on driving the tender for Jana. So he actually enjoyed so much taking the artists to these remote, and he was really hours and hours and hours out there in the most freezing conditions. And, you know, he just loved it. And that's what was so important for me, there was such a good relationship between the crew and you guys. I mean, maybe that's something that one should really talk about, because that's what makes that relationship unique. But I also want to ask you about how, when you came back and the further contacts you had with MIT and presenting the work, I mean, has this sort of experience or being part of this Living Archive project led to anything yet, or is that something you feel is being part of a bigger picture? Is that something that is intriguing to you, or do you feel removed from that and rather prefer to work on your own? Does that make sense?
You mean in terms of working on my own? How to say that?
You do work on your own very much.
Yeah, I work a lot on my own, but you know, this, how we worked in Iceland, we also made the possibility that we were spending that much time that we could concentrate, even though we weren't totally alone all the time, if that's what you mean. But
yes.
But of course, I like to think about this project as in the long-term process, you know. So for me, the recordings I did in Iceland was, in terms of this project that you mentioned, where I'm following the development of coral reefs around the planet. Yeah. You know, I'm very you know, excited about the possibility of going to then around
Could you
the
describe
America.
that project a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's the coral reefs are endangered by acidification of the oceans and the temperature changes they are very sensitive to. We have deep coral reefs. There's some outside of Iceland and also outside of Norway. Though there is a discussion how important the coral reefs are for the biodiversity in this area, the habitats that are living there. I mean, I was just recently talking to a marine biologist that I do ever so often. I have this guy in Norway that I always have to kind of check with before I start spreading any kind of wrong things, you know. And I mean, he was mentioning something that I hadn't thought about, you know, that coral reefs, they are very beautiful, they're visually very attractive, and they get attention very much because of that, you know. And then to then look into how important are they for the smaller species to grow and so, you know, and this more popular view of how we look at coral reefs, for example, you know, and, you know, to develop this thought and then before going there, and he suggested ways of looking at it over a period of time, you know, and a distance away from certain, between different habitats of, you know, forest, like the mangrove forest towards the coral reefs in Florida, for example. You know, there's lots of things that comes up, you know, I could go on for a long time, but for me this is like a starting point. It was with the Dardanella on Iceland, like diving into the water there on this project specifically. And it was really nice to talk to Marianne, for example, about the echolocation. That's another project I work on, also on a long-term basis. And my performance tonight, in that case, it's more echolocation from bats, and I'm also occupied with echolocation from dolphins and smaller whales that are also on the coral reefs. You know, so it becomes a collection of, for a broader, not just this project, you know, when you are in this kind of areas,
Well, we started actually, obviously, this project with a lot of emphasis on to the sound and composition of new music. Obviously, we're looking and hoping to attract artists from many different disciplines. But Adam, I just wanted to point out your name is up here in the front here, and so I was wondering if I could ask you to come up here and say a few words about your community of interest and scientific community, and how they're dealing with their sharing of data, and how sharing on the internet, but also through a series of workshops and planning projects together. I mean, you're involved in so many laboratories of thought. Please, could you give us an unprepared talk, but something to share with us?
Sure.
Your background. This is Adam Bly, CEO of Seed Media Group in New York. A very, very interesting scientific-based community of bringing a lot of scientific research together, but has also incorporated art and design, and that's how we met into this fold. So maybe somebody coming more from the scientific world than from the artistic one, but we share a lot of goals together.
Yep.
So maybe over to you.
So one of the things that struck me just listening the last few minutes is one of the most fascinating movements in science today. I guess there's two that have been particularly pertinent to this project. One is citizen science and the rise of not only, so citizen science, the term being used for turning, in many cases, rather data-intensive scientific research projects over to the world, to non-scientists, but to contribute in a way that's genuinely constructive to the process of science. So we've seen just very, very recently in the last couple of weeks the results of a project where protein sequencing was turned over to game designers, a project called Fold It, and it helped reveal some insights into HIV that scientists themselves weren't able to tackle. By turning the data over to the gaming community, it's resulted in some really profound insights. And so this is happening across lots of domains. It's happening in the biological sciences, in the physical sciences, in the life sciences, in environmental sciences. We're seeing oil spills being tracked, and climate being measured, and birds being watched, but not being done only through the power of observation, but also in terms of collecting data, whether through mobile devices, or even just annotation. And so not only is this kind of burgeoning, but it's also now developing an empirical foundation, that it's actually, it's doing something that's contributing to the scientific opus in a way that couldn't be done just by scientists. So a project like this opens up, a tremendous opportunity to engage local communities. First of all, engage a global community, anybody kind of involved in the project, to contribute to something or a series of questions that science says, you know what, we would benefit from it being crowdsourced to actually contribute to. So that may be an interesting kind of thought experiment when we're at MIT or something, is kind of what are some of those big open citizen science questions that a journey like this could help to advance. The other sort of really interesting question now, there's been some interesting examples of local populations in Latin America that have been using so they're using data visualization to help them understand local environmental or political issues, but they're doing it in a way that's analog instead of digital. So they're not going out. These are populations that don't have, sophisticated sensing devices, but all they're doing is actually just sending their communities out to measure certain things, but actually just take notes about either the local geography and how it's being changed as a result of climate change, or things like this, or counting specific species. And then they're bringing this data back, this is just in the last year or so, and developing maps together kind of as a community that reports this data, and then take those maps and engage local policymakers in driving policy about kind of local issues. So it also strikes me like the project could be very interesting at a port level to undertake some of these crowd visualization projects, even if they're not driven by sophisticated sensing data or sensor data, but actually kind of analog physically notating things about a particular thing in that microenvironment. But this voyage can help to organize those things. The other kind of equally interesting trend that's relevant, so this one being citizen science and data visualization, the other is open science, and something Francesca mentioned. And here, I think the part that's relevant, so this is really about, science itself is recognizing that disciplines were very useful, in the 20th century. We mapped the human genome and went to the moon and cured diseases by organizing information into disciplines. And now we're recognizing that multidisciplinarity is not just a trend for the sake of a trend, but it's really because when you map all of science, there's these amazing projects now to just take all of science, all the papers being published over the course of, let's say, a decade, and you actually map them by disciplines, you see where the most interesting stuff is happening. And it's not in these kind of pockets of disciplines, it is somewhere in the fog in between, in the cloud in between. And so that necessitates kind of restructuring science and restructuring how you organize information. And two very practical things that relate to the project are, one is the taxonomy of all this. So we talked about this earlier today, and I think this is a good kind of open thought process that needs to happen, is how do you actually organize this information? How do you even just tag it in a way that's useful, but that doesn't prejudice it towards disciplines? It doesn't call things biology or physics or chemistry or life science or environment, or if it's not only that, it doesn't sort of prejudice the way we might arrive at sort of systems understandings of biodiversity or of diversity or cultural diversity. So this is an interesting moment, because science is struggling with the same thing for these new open collaborative systems, is what's the taxonomy, what's the nomenclature to organize all this data. And a project like this could have its own taxonomy. It could be, we ask these 100 people to come up with a system of knowledge of how we might just organize information, never mind what it is that we'll collect, but how we will organize it. And that could be just a profound contribution to the world, is just a system of knowledge of how all this is organized. And the other part, just continuing on the open science theme, the last point is, so the boat could also be useful to the scientific community, because it's going to be in places and have capabilities of sensing things, and adding more sensors, and more sensors are frankly inexpensive and useful to just take more data and make this data available in real time to the scientific community. And because the location of the boat is a fixed coordinate that maps to other systems. So I showed Francesca today a project that Craig Venter, who mapped the human genome, and now has a vessel called the Sorcerer 2 that's been navigating around the world, the waters of the world, to take just drops of water everywhere to look for the millions of species that we've never before sequenced, and they're sequencing it on the boat. So just by way of a small example, you know that this is a latitude, longitude coordinate, and being able to just, we have data about local cultural diversity, or we have data about something that we've taken from this particular environment, but that can get mashed up with the species diversity from Sorcerer 2, or the X, Y, and Z types of diversity that are being mapped and aggregated by other types of scientific vessels like this. So just thinking about how to kind of mash up the data that this will collect with other types of expeditions like this, so that it becomes almost like a portal into, at this particular moment, at this particular time, these are all the different things we know about this particular microenvironment from what we're doing and from what others have done. And just a way of kind of expanding on the idea of diversity.
Thank you. It sounds a bit to me like there's a comment made this morning that was saying, we were talking about Afghanistan, and Mario is an artist who's here with us and spending quite a bit of time over there on a project for Documenta. And one of the things that he said was, one really needs to be aware of mining content and then moving on, and how this might also reflect really badly on the project. If you visibly just go in, mine, take a brief look around, you're actually then only participating in it's breaking it up rather than actually focusing attention on it in a positive sense. So I think collecting data is a sort of very sensitive issue, and I'm actually realizing how much more complicated it is than I anticipated when I launched myself into this direction. But Tony, when we looked at the systems and we have them on the boat, I mean, how do you see recording? Is it not just data of location and sign? Because recording sound is a very important. But you're also aware of some of the other projects that we're considering, and how this technology could be brought forward.
Yeah, I'm sort of constantly surprised, really, to find that within the scientific community, things that we from people who come from a more artistic background take for granted are quite special attributes of data gathering. So, for example, when I started to engage more seriously with people from Cornell University and started to hear their sounds, I couldn't believe how terrible they were. Primarily, they analyze data visually. They capture audio data, they translate it into images, and then they go, well, that's this species, that's this species, and they understand from that. But when they heard the quality of sound that we would normally capture with decent quality equipment, that we wouldn't dream of making anything as poor quality as they were able to use, a huge amount more data became available. The possibilities that they saw in working in that way. Now, of course, they've been practically restricted by the types of technology they've used, the types of submersible buoys that have these pop-up buoys which live underwater for months at a time. So they have to draw no energy. They have to be very efficient. So low sample rates, very poor quality audio. In most cases, the loudest noise that they ever record is the hard drive whirring up in these devices. This is the norm for that type of scientific practice, whereas that would be absolutely outrageous if it was in an artistic practice. And I think we hear the quality of work that Jana will play back later. You'll see that it's a very long way away, and consequently the resolution of that data is far more significant, and also the applicability in terms of what else it's capturing, in terms of the environment, in terms of the geology, the resonance that comes from whales singing in a particular geological environment. And so on. All of that is part of that data, and it's not part of the scientific data set, which is quite interesting. I was also, again, talking with some of the same scientists about whether or not it was interesting that you had spotted certain whales randomly, not particularly looking for whales in a particular area. And it turns out that they're very interested in that sort of random sampling of data, rather than the more carefully organised approaches, which they have to say, we're going to look in this area, or we're going to look at how many people how many whales pass this point, or something of that sort. So I think there's quite a lot that current practice, professional artistic practice, can bring to science. And it's a matter of really trying to connect up with the right sort of people who can utilise this data and bring it forward. But at the moment, it's not. It's there's a lot of interest, and people that seem quite enthusiastic to embrace surround sound, which is something we're interested in from an artistic perspective, but lots of scientists are interested in because it gives them a positional and movement vector associated with data that wouldn't otherwise have it.
I do apologise to everybody if this sounds like a work in progress, but it very much is. Rather than us, a panel sitting up here with sort of a really concrete project that we've thoroughly worked out. But one of the things that we talked about with Bruce on my way over here was that this sort of art and science community has had a sort of relatively bumpy road over the last decade, that it's been flirting with each other. And Jana, you come from both of these backgrounds. You are a scientist and you are an artist. And, how do you see it when other artists try to embrace a scientific project or vice versa? Does it strike you as a sort of usually a clumsy reunion, or is it something that we can actually count on being able to?
Yeah, I have seen projects where you, for example, the Polar Institutes decided to put money to invite an artist to come on board and go on the trip to the Svalbard, for example. And I tend to think then when it's been decided in that way that you apply with a project to go there, and it should really rather come from the artists or from the scientists in that sense, and not being created and put together. You will work with, that doesn't work at all. Of course, it did help me when I was in the Barents Sea with, I made a phone call and I said, I really need to learn more about how cod make sound, and, how do you work on the material, how do you collect the material in the Barents Sea? And that was just like a phone call, and I said immediately, yeah, come along, no problem. And so I was with them for a week, and that worked well for me to have a bit of background in chemistry and to communicate. But of course, it's easier for an artist somehow to go to a scientist than a scientist coming to an artist. Because if I'm not now talking about the natural science and marine biologists specifically, but as I mentioned, this marine biologist in Bergen that I often communicate with, I tell him what I find, and he's sort of saying, "Oh, I didn't know that, say this Norwegian pollock is making sound when they're hunting smaller fish, for example." So, but I know he likes to involve me because in his project, because he's struggling within his community to get funding for, not funding, but what do you call it, ears for looking further into sound use by fish. So by us talking together and hopefully enthusiasts. I got my English today.
You speak better cod than English.
I speak better cod. I don't know. Yeah, but I think your question in terms of how
do you
to
see other
collaborate
people? Yeah.
and how I see other. I think it has been quite a few projects like this when an artist becomes an onlooker and comes back with, oh, this was very strange, and not necessarily any exchange going, and so I think basically it just really needs to come from the project that the artists or then the scientists are working with, and that's not necessarily so they know why they're working together, and discuss this for a while and figure out, is this fitting, is this,
Well, I think as the project continues, each one of you are fellows of this project, and as this pool of fellows enlarges, we will obviously, it will become more of a word of mouth community where people can interact together. But what would be the pitfalls to be avoided, Fionn? You know, where I want to know what we should not do, not rather what we can do. But what would be your advice in terms of avoiding certain? Because obviously the word interdisciplinary is overused, but on the other hand, it is a way forward, and it's this area in between which is actually yielding the most interesting results and the biggest, and actually some of the most interesting conversations in terms of creativity, in terms of exploration in a sort of non-laboratory scenario. Where would you draw the line?
Well, I mean, I think in a project of this nature, if you don't get in trouble, then it's not a very interesting project.
No, we'll get into plenty
But
of trouble.
what I mean by that is that I think the idea of social exchange and the way in which that occurs, and that the invitation has some different dynamics, and so that it's not the solitary artist each time researching, something that then they will then author. Perhaps it's an artist that actually their process involves a direct encounter with people that they work that way. They work with a bit of like an agonistic element in their work. I think so. To me, that would be. I mean, if it's a living archive, that sense of also the social dynamic really being quite different in various places that you're going, and also even the way in which. And another thing would be the way in which artists often will be involved with research, and even in terms of landscape, but it can be very like sample driven. But like a lot of sound artists I've worked with, from like Stephen Viciello, Steve Roden, Marina Rosenfeld, like goes out to, Marianne Amiche, more sound artists, like in a sense, but they're often doing research they'll be doing research that is quite specific and could be used even in a scientific sense, but then they're interpreting it into the social. Do you know? So the endpoint is not as a kind of in a data sense, but it could actually be. That's what's interesting about the Dardanella, is that it could be there as data, but then it also is interpreted into an art project by a given, say, an artist who sees it as ultimately, even if it's more musical or more literary or something along
Going
those
in
lines.
direction.
Yeah.
No, I'm weary. I suppose the one thing that frightens me the most is always this sense that you might just parachute into something. So how do you keep this sense of bottom-up approach and reach? Because, for instance, in South America, a friend of mine just mentioned to me, there is a sense of, suspicion, very strong suspicion, and therefore huge resistance against foreigners coming in. There's this hangover of colonization. In the same way there's in certain countries a hangover for colonization, like in India, or, it seems to be a hangover that never seems to go away. And I was told that even they'd be quite a lot more suspicious of anybody arriving by boat as well. It would increase the level of suspicion. So, I mean, how do we prepare for that sort of, and is that resistance something that is to be encouraged, and that's what triggers off great projects, and the fact that it is that difficult, and if it's all, that you want that sort of struggle as well within the project?
I think it probably you'd want some of,
Bit of both.
A bit of both. but when you look, I don't know, if you look at like what A.O. Weitzman or Tom Keenan are involved with in this decolonizing architecture project, that is an ongoing research project that gets into the problem of the notion of evidence is often aesthetically construed. Evidence is, and in many instances that are have real, impact socially and politically, the evidence is aesthetically construed, and they've gone through and kind of like addressed that in various kind of, I would say, highly contentious places. So, in a sense, and highly contentious issues and notions of like threshold issues or boundary issues.
Race issues.
Yeah, I mean, and artists that I've worked with also, like Sublime Frequencies, which is a very interesting collective of filmmakers, and do a lot of field recordings, and they also pirate music from various places that they go to, they've been doing this for 20 years now, and they're from various different backgrounds, mostly in Africa and Southeast Asia, and also to some degree in South America, and they actually, in a sense, their sense of it is that no one is doing the direct encounter, in a sense, and that they're not. It's not that they're not interested in where they're going; they know a lot about it. But the direct encounter includes even the appropriation of popular material in these places, as well as collaborative projects that sustain with people from those places. And it's interesting, they found out that they were the subject of a symposia at UCLA, which has one of the more interesting ethnomusical or advanced ethnomusicology departments. They found out they were the subject of a symposia, a week-long symposia, that they weren't even been invited to. So they found out.
So they must be pirates.
Well, meaning that they're getting into the issues in a ways that sometimes you can't get into by being too correct and or even having an agreed upon methodology going in. Some of this, and I think what you were saying, some of it is incidental and involves like a invitation to collective collective that is you can't really, in a sense, predict the result. I mean, it's not that sort of scientific method.
So I would turn the question to you, Adam, before I turn it over to the rest of the people here today. Where do you draw that line, and where would the pitfalls lie from the scientific community side? If we were to try and, I mean, I would approach you and say, look, we're going to be in Honduras, and obviously there's this and this and this point of interest there, and I've been thinking about inviting X, Y, Z. Can you think of somebody who has an interest? And I know you will immediately come up with the names of 14 people and then narrow it down to 3, because you've just got such an amazing network. But you've also seen the pitfalls of art and science coming together and being rather embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to the first part of that pitfall of parachuting in, that concern, so some things, science gets a buy with that, because if the intent is to really, understand the world, and if the intent is pure and it's really about putting that knowledge back out into the world, science has somehow reconciled that. It's okay if it's under the it's okay if it's following if it's following a scientific method, if it is putting that information back into the public domain. Maybe art somehow struggles with it more than science, but science doesn't struggle with that. That's part of the infrastructure of science, to go out into the field and investigate and understand it and bring back and report back the findings.
But communicate those findings.
And communicate those findings critically, especially, I mean, there's been projects where, Native American populations where geneticists have gone in and taken blood samples in order, and then to do DNA testing, and there was great fear of coming in, but there was such interest in doing these out of Africa projects over the last decade to map human migration, and a huge part of it has been going into these local populations, getting blood samples, getting spit samples, but the way they were able to achieve it is by then going back and showing them the photos of your ancestors and your common ancestors. So there was a sort of storytelling, communication capacity of science to reveal something that benefited the local population. So that's a huge part. The pitfalls of art and science are, we talked about them, I think. One of them is collaboration for the sake of collaboration. I think that's the pitfall. It's just that this is so interesting and exciting, so let's just get 10 artists and 10 scientists together, and so that's one. The other is, as you cited, is kind of, we're doing this scientific thing, and we can get an extra $100,000 grant if we bring an artist on board. Awesome. Give us an idea and we'll bring an artist, because why not? The way to avoid it is by actually recognizing the limitations of the scientific capacity, faculty, craft, and recognizing the unique capacities of art, and engaging people in these kinds of collaborations that see that, that see that there are certain things that science just doesn't allow for, and its method doesn't allow for, and art does. And it might be much more profound observation and frankly a more flexible capacity to observe things. It might be the ability to synthesize in a way that science doesn't have necessarily the capacity to because of the disciplinary boundaries. And it may also be the ability to actually experience things as opposed to just document things and codify them and quantify them. But you know, if you're studying things like consciousness or memory or things that are neuroscience, for example, there's a profoundly empirical contribution of the Prousts and Cézannes and things like that to understanding neuroscience and even anticipating scientific advances in neuroscience because you're dealing with things that are experiential in nature and experiencing something and hearing the sounds, as you said, and distinguishing between listening and hearing. These things have value. So it's about having scientists who see the limits of science and having artists who also see the limits of art, frankly, but you know, kind of they complete each other's sentences. And that's where you've seen the most, you know, meaningful art science contributions is where there's a sense of we each have limits to our craft, basically.
I'm watching my captain looking very confused. Stewart, just to wrap this up, I mean, when you encountered, you obviously had some really great chats with Chris and Jana, and you had the chance to interact. I know that the crew responded very well to this, and this has charged them up with a sense of respect for the project, but as well responsibility to assist and make it happen, and bring maybe some people from the sailing community as well to the attention of this project, and bring people forward that can really even contribute from also a seamanship point of view.
Yeah, I think your example of Sander earlier on is brilliant. It's so true that he's sort of so into the outdoors nature of the boat and this project that he has sort of, I wouldn't say no interest, that's not fair, but his main focus now is to be off Dardanella as much as he can in the tenders with these guys having fun. But he also sort of feels this huge sense of responsibility that every time you go, like with the Blue Whale, for example, that may be your one chance. And so if everything isn't properly working, if the batteries aren't charged, if whatever it is, doesn't matter, that he takes it upon himself. And I think the crew of the boat feel that responsibility because we're there to support, but also to help deliver. And so I think the crew all have to learn that detail is very important in these projects, and it is about, you might hear one creature or whatever it is once, and it has to work. And whilst yacht crews are good at some things, they're perhaps not as good at others. But I think having people like Sander on board are really vital, because his enthusiasm also gets a sound recordist who perhaps isn't feeling too well in a little boat in the sea through those dark moments. And so I think it works both ways.
Yeah. I'd like to turn it over to you guys before you all fall asleep, and then we can go and have a drink in the garden, and I think Slaven's going to do his performance. We're nearly sort of a bit late now already. But is there anybody who would like to ask a question or contribute an idea, or we can do that over dinner? Yeah, I was hoping you would say something, Adrian.
Got a microphone as well?
Yeah, he's got a mic. It's ready.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting conversation. I want to refer to a question that Francesca asked, which is, how do you avoid the colonial suspicion of the project? And I think it's an important question, but maybe it's being asked in the wrong way. It needs to be reframed because you can't avoid it. And so then the question is, well, how do you somehow embrace it or own it as a kind of position, right? So if you think back, 1786, James Cook sets out, is sort of exploring the Pacific. He has Sir Joseph Banks on board, who's a botanist, who's doing these sort of fine illustrations. There's almost this incredible tradition already of a kind of scientific project related to an artistic project on boats, and it is a colonial project. So actually, my first suggestion would be find out about them and kind of research them, and invite someone on board who's actually going to be then potentially quite critical, or almost in a way reflect on the process itself. And I think by somehow not so much trying to avoid that, but actually directly engaging it and making it part of the work, then this would be the first way I would start.
That's a great point. Yeah. It takes away the fear element, because there's something, I hate colonization more than anything on earth. I think it's, as a social phenomena, it's probably the most destructive and disruptive one of all mankind has ever invented. War is much less destructive in a way than colonization. So I think the idea of colonizing intellectually any part of the world, trying to bring in something you think you know better is a for me, is a horror. But anyway, anybody, thank you, Adrian.